All right, folks. We are live on Facebook. Good afternoon. Rob Smith over at Marquette University, Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach. Adam, what's going on, man?
Hey, happy to be here.
Well, we are in our second conversation this month about voting rights. And today we really want to have an opportunity to talk about the importance of young people in that process, our college students, and even high school students in some respects. You know, the longstanding campaign for voter equality has been multi-generational indeed. And so we want to make sure to highlight some of those themes today. We've got some pretty awesome folks with us, and we're going to allow them to introduce themselves. I want to make sure to highlight this image here from Freedom Summer, 1964, where college students walked into the belly of the beast, went down the Mississippi to help register African Americans across the state and in some of the most rural parts of the state, and at the same time did a wonderful job in encouraging and being a part of some of the groundswell of activism that would come out of Mississippi around voting rights. And so, as we oftentimes do, we like to use images to tell some stories. Want to keep going, Keisha? We got our same folks in Command Central. Keisha and Ben are keeping us on schedule. We're on Facebook as well. Let's give our attendees an opportunity to introduce themselves, Adam.
Absolutely. So, you all will do a bet. How about this? We'll give each of you about 20, 30 seconds to just tell us who you are. And let's start. I'll go down. Raisha isn't able to join us today. I'll go down the list here. Peter, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Peter Burris. Thank you, Rob and Adam, for having me. I am the Wisconsin campaign manager with All Voting is Local, which is a nonpartisan voting rights project housed at the Leadership Conference Education Fund and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
And Peter really is a co-conspirator today. Peter did a great job helping to make sure we get the right voices on this conversation today. And it's a great opportunity for us to partner with All Voting is Local and the other folks here on the call today, because we know how important the work is you do around voting rights. So thanks, Peter. We appreciate you, man.
Kristen.
Hi, everyone. Kristen Hansen with the Campus Vote Project. I am the Wisconsin State Coordinator. The Campus Vote Project is a program of the Fair Elections Center out of Washington, D.C. The Fair Elections Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest law firm that focuses on cases around voting rights. And the Campus Vote Project has people like me on the ground in the states in about, I think, 10 or 11 states now. And we work with campuses across the country. I think we're over 275 campuses now that we work with. Excited to be here.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
Looking forward to working with you as well, Kristen. This is going to be not only an important time, but a fun time to really be a part of these conversations. It's great.
It is.
And Brianna, do you prefer Bree?
Bree is fine. Yeah.
All right. So Bree.
So I'm Bree, student at Marquette University, going into my senior year studying political science. I'm an Andrew Gimmin Foundation campus ambassador. I'm also an intern with Curdo, research intern with Curdo Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach.
All right. Well, we are excited to have all of you here, and that's kind of the basics of your background. Let's move to the next slide. As a way of getting the conversation started, this is a history series, so we want to ask a question that's a little bit reflective, just as a warm-up, to discuss the significance of the passing of John Lewis on the current generation and the message sent through his funeral services. When we established the idea of doing this series in August, little did we know it would be kind of within the frame of a really consequential moment for discussions around voting rights. We knew it would be important, but it was fortuitous how relevant it's become over the past few weeks. So can you guys talk a little bit about your interpretation of the significance of John Lewis, his legacy, and how you feel that fuses into work that's yet to be done?
And as you all gather your thoughts, we want to make sure that our attendees jump in with the chat. You all know how we do this. We want to hear from you. We want to engage with you. What's up, Kristen, over at Wisconsin Historical Society, and Heather, one of our awesome educators who works with us. We appreciate you all joining us, Nate, Lisa, and everybody else. We're a bunch of repeaters over here, so thank you for joining us. And I'm just filling some time so that our panelists get a chance to gather their thoughts. I'm just rambling a little bit. Who's ready? Who wants to jump in?
I can start.
Let's talk about John Lewis, Kristen.
Let's talk about John Lewis. Don't tell my boss, but I could not tear myself away from the funeral. I watched like the entire 4 hours of it on a workday. Oops.
That's the job responsibility.
Yeah.
I think the thread that seemed to be, to me, running through all of the speakers at his funeral was the fact that while he got himself into a lot of necessary good trouble, which I think is a wonderful thing to use that phrase, he always had a strategy. They were constantly talking about his grace, his intelligence, and the fact that he knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. It wasn't just rabble-rousing for the sake of rabble-rousing. He had a plan. And I think that is something that people can really take from his work. I also think that his life in general, I hope, will be studied in history classes for decades to come. He lived a very long life and really, he was working on voting rights for over 60 years. There's a lot there. And that in and of itself should be part of an entire history curriculum. And I'm looking forward to that happening. But yeah, I think people should really study what he did and the strategies he used and the fact that he brought so many people together to affect those strategies. The other thing that they talked a lot about was that even though he was elected to Congress and of course reelected so many times, he never forgot his district and where he came from. The reason he got reelected so many times is that he consistently paid attention to what the people of his district really wanted from him and was back there all the time listening to them. Any elected official or someone who wants to go into electoral politics should remember that. Many times people get elected to Congress and forget where they came from, and he never did.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Who's up next? Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said, and I think it is important to study the history of John Lewis and other I would say freedom fighters during that time fighting for voting rights, because without it we kind of get lost, like the younger generation, and people kind of forget what voting means, or who came before us. And I think it's also important because a lot of times we try to reinvent the wheel instead of going back and looking at what they did during that time. So when you said study the history and learn more on about John Lewis and what he did in his tenure, I think it is important, because a lot of times we're always trying to figure out how do we get people to care, how do we get people to understand that their vote matters. But if they done it and they passed the whole Civil Rights Act based off showing people that their vote matters. So I think that it is super important to go back and relearn the history of John Lewis and others who was in the fight with him.
Well, Bree, it's also a fascinating history. Not only is it important civic education, but it's just a remarkable story, in terms of folks' experiences in the South and grappling with Jim Crow, and then the importance of historically Black colleges and universities. It's just, there's so many threads to his life that is instructive in so many ways. Peter, what you got? Kind of thoughts you would like to share with us?
Oh, too much to add. I think, you talked about this a little bit last week. There's just no separating John Lewis from the fight for voting rights, and voting rights in the way that they're foundational to our civil and human rights. And I think, as you saw with the memorial and so much of the coverage around his passing, it's clear how many young people are impacted by his story, and how he's really the entry point into understanding and fighting for voting rights for so many people, and myself included. I didn't really start thinking about the importance of voting rights until undergrad, when I took a trip with a group of students to the Edmund Pettus Bridge to learn about his work, and to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. And if anybody has, if you haven't been to that museum and have the chance, it's just about the most incredible museum, which John Lewis had a heavy hand in building, and is a very clear presence. And I'll never forget the end of that museum. There's a big video with people marching for different areas of justice. And I stepped into the room halfway through, started the video again once it began, and a woman came and sat down next to me, and video ended, felt her take a deep breath, and she said, "Isn't that just about the most powerful thing you've ever seen?" The way that this video captures young people, and the power that young people have to impact democracy in the United States and in the world. And so, I think it's just such a clear representative of the power of young people, and in particular young Black people, and one of the main reasons that folks are fighting so hard to suppress the power of young people, and in particular young Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for those very insightful and warm comments, because I think it is important for us on an ongoing basis to not only come back to John Lewis, but C.T. Vivian and some of the other folks we've lost this year. And as we as we face abrasive racism and fascism coming from DC, it's ever more important. And that's the umbrella, of course, that all this sits in, alongside or including a pandemic. And Peter, the museum is remarkable, because it's not only a remarkable gathering of the story of civil rights in the U.S. It's global in its approach, and to connect these struggles and these issues here in the U.S. to other struggles across the globe is really critical. The last thing I'll add, I know we got to get into some of our other themes, is because we're thinking about these conversations for the classroom. John Lewis also represents an important thread that we often use the language from protest to politics. What happens after the protest moment? What do you do once you've demonstrated, you've boycotted, you've raised a certain amount of social awareness to an issue. There has been legislative change or some sort of policy change. Then what happens? And as we know, in some ways that is an even more challenging uphill battle. That's a different fight, obviously, but it's still significantly challenging, because you have to move institutions and move politics and move people in ways that are it's a heavy lift. And so from protest to politics.
If I would that's something that we've been talking about through the story of the open housing marches, of the Chapman Hall takeover, some local history, which is sometimes the fearlessness of youth. How it can connect to the ideas of making institutional, systemic, sustained change, and John Lewis's life is a blueprint for that. Within the different seasons of his life, he's kind of a one-man version of how youthful exuberance and righteousness can turn into a career of creating change within the system you came out to protest in the first place. So with that, maybe this is a conversation focusing on the power of and the challenges of students voting. Keisha, can we move to the next slide?
Keisha's in Command Central with Ben. Thank you, folks. Go ahead, man. Go ahead, Adam.
Well, these are just kind of our questions. Last week we discussed the history of voting rights, and we tried to cover as much as we could in the course of an hour. And these are kind of the entry-level questions we wanted to do, is to establish the contemporary landscape and contemporary ecosystem of voting as we face it right now in Wisconsin. So we want to talk a little bit about Act 23, about voter ID laws, and then also just kind of the broader question of voting rights and how people can get involved. So let's start with Act 23. Who wants to, I'll throw up the alley-oop. Who wants to give a first pass at its impact and actually what it is and its impact that it continues to have on student voters in the state?
I can take that unless somebody else wants to.
Go for it.
Okay. I was actually working at the American Civil Liberties Union when this act went into effect, so I know a lot about it. It was Act 23 of 2011, but we know it more broadly as the voter ID law. And even though it's called that, was a lot more. It was really a very broad voter suppression law. Voter ID was a big part of it, but there were a lot of components of that. And many of them had been fought in court for years, and a recent decision by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago reinstated a lot of the things that had been on hold because of previous successful cases. And one of those things was that has now been overturned was that it used to be up to the clerks to decide how much early voting that they would allow. So in Milwaukee and Madison, two of the largest cities in Wisconsin, you could have, several weeks of early voting, in-person early voting. So folks could go when they could. The impact on student voters for this, of course, is students have very strange schedules, right? And some of it's because their class schedules could be all over the place. They have work they're trying to fit in there. They have commutes potentially they're trying to fit in there. Being able to vote in person over a long period of time made a big difference for student voters and for all voters, really. That has now been turned back, and the clerks cannot expand early voting beyond the 2 weeks previous to the election. So that cuts back a lot of in-person voting time. But of course, the biggest thing about this was the student IDs that would be eligible to be used for photo ID. Our Fair Election Center, my employer, has a lawsuit right now. In fact, I just reviewed a brief we're about to submit to try to lift some of the requirements of those IDs because they're not used for anything. And actually the Seventh Circuit did us a little bit of a favor on that by agreeing that having an expiration date on a student ID that can be expired and still be used doesn't make any sense. These student IDs also have to have signatures on them, even though no one looks at that signature in the polling place and compares it to anything. If we win on those two things, every college ID in Wisconsin would be compliant with the voter ID law. So we're still working on that. But basically what they did was, on top of all the other things that are wrong with a photo ID law, they specifically carved out exceptions for college IDs that make no sense. The fact that even if you go to a four-year university, the ID has to have an expiration date not more than 2 years from issuance makes no sense. The fact that it has to have a signature makes no sense. It initially said it was supposed to have an address on it. And since college students use those IDs to get into their dorm rooms, you lose your ID and it's got your address on it. Anybody could grab that ID and get into your dorm room. I mean, so there were we got some of the fixes done, but it's yet another hurdle. And of course, as you all know, students have to not only have that ID that's compliant, they have to prove that they're enrolled at the same time. So it's very unfortunate that they carved out specific things to make it harder for students to vote. Luckily, groups like All Voting is Local and Andrew Goodman Foundation and the Campus Vote Project and all of the other great groups that we work with are working really hard to make sure that everyone understands what they need to vote, and we're not going to let this stop us.
Thanks, Kristen. That was very thorough. Does anybody want to add more to that? Peter, you want to add to that? And Bree, we're going to come to you because we want to hear about what students just feel and think about the ID issue. So we'll come to you in a sec. Peter, what else can you add to that for us?
I think a couple of things. Kristen covered so much of it. I think I would add how many students we're talking about in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, and Kristen or somebody else, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are over 300,000 students at any given time in Wisconsin. So if students were their own city, right, it'd be the second largest city in Wisconsin. So it makes sense that legislation aimed at suppressing the power of the student vote would, or young people, I should say, in general, would target the student vote with these needless and discriminatory attempts to limit what can be used as a photo ID, student ID specifically. So I think that number is really powerful to think about. Also important to situate this in the early 2010s, a lot was happening. Wisconsin was not the only state passing photo ID laws. It was happening across the country.
Right.
This is happening right around the same time that the Voting Rights Act was gutted in the Shelby County case.
Right.
In Wisconsin in particular, we've got a redrawing of our districts, which we know has had a terrible impact on our democracy. So like a lot happened in the early 2010s. And in Wisconsin, photo ID law was particularly horrific. And I think two other things. First, just to keep in mind that so many students are from out of state. So it's totally nonsense that an Illinois driver's license or a Minnesota driver's license, for example, can't count as a Wisconsin photo ID. Anything that proves your identity, if we're going to have this photo ID law in place, which we can talk about separately, whether it's necessary, I don't think it is. But if this is going to be in place, we need as many options as possible for folks. And there's no reason that it should be exclusively a state driver's license or this narrow list of other options. And the evidence is pretty clear from 2016, the impact of this photo ID law. Study from UW-Madison found that likely over 16,000 voters in Dane and Milwaukee counties alone were deterred from voting because of this law. And scale that up to the statewide level, and it's pretty clear how suppressive this mechanism is.
Yeah, thanks. We appreciate the detail and the depth. Not only are students generally transient, even if they happen to live in the, let's say, Madison area, they can move every year. We for those of us who have the luxury to go to college, I feel like I was moving every 9 months, along with all the other stuff that goes on. But the college voters are also somewhat progressive. They don't vote in high numbers, but they typically vote far more left. And so there's obviously political consequences to that. Bree, talk to us as best as you can about just where students are with this stuff. What's the student pulse on, voter IDs and voting and politics? Just give us some insight.
Well, like students right now, I feel like everyone is really weary about voting right now, whether it be coronavirus or whether it be, just how politics is running in general today. But as far as like the voter ID, when I first went to go vote, I was still in high school. I turned 18 in high school. So, and I went to go vote and they said I didn't have like a valid ID, but I'm like, it was valid, and I ended up leaving. And that was like my first voting experience. So with me being like going to a political science major, I wanted to come back. But some people, that being your first experience, you may never want to go back and vote again, like with that. Because for one, it's kind of embarrassing to be turned away from anything, whether it's wherever you're at, you're being turned away to go vote. And then secondly, it just made it much more difficult. So I had to go to the DMV and go get like a official Wisconsin ID because I just turned 18 and everything, and then come back for the actual election because I was a primary. I couldn't vote in and vote, and I was just like, this is a lot. But going into being in school right now, I don't even think we can vote on campus because of coronavirus. So that's also another obstacle that people probably don't want to go through to go vote. And it's really difficult trying to get those absentee ballots sent out to dorms, things like that. So it's been a lot of obstacles right now for college students in specific. I would say high school students also, because I know like a lot of high school students, they're trying to vote as well. They don't really know what to do. So I think like something like this is important to even share with high school teachers or going to senior year, things like that. But because there are so many obstacles, and then you don't usually see, like you said, more college students are like more progressive voters and things like that. So you don't really see the candidates you always want. It's kind of, it becomes a lot on students and, young people to be like, oh, we're going to vote for this person and hopefully they'll win. But, then you turn back, now we have to vote because it's for a specific, party, stay within your party group. And a lot of young people don't really understand that mechanism. And I feel like they're going to turn away from it a lot of times. So that's one of the things in politics that don't really get talked about is, people are going to turn away from that, vote within party. They're just probably not going to vote at all, especially with all the obstacles on top of that. So politics in the younger community right now, I think people are not really as up for it as we used to be, as we were, back when, Barack was in office and everyone wanted to go be proactive about voting and get out there. Now it's just kind of like a duty at this point. Like they say, it's not something fun. It's more something like work, extra work you have to take on that fits into your already you have a work schedule, school schedule, so you have to fit that in there. So it's not really, I would say, the best right now, but there's a lot of people who are trying to uplift, and that's why I say it's always important to go back and look at the history, because that's one thing I know young Black people who are in the movement, we always go back and look at the ancestors, look at the elders, and understand that they fought for us. So that's something that empowers us as well. So as long as we keep pushing the message of, the history of voting, why it's important for us to vote, and that at some point, our voice will make a difference, I think that, that'll empower more young people to get out and vote.
Yeah,
I appreciate the point that you made. Just it was kind of across all three of yours, which is navigating bureaucracy is unpleasant for anybody of any age. But in particular, I mean, if you're younger, I mean, that point you made just culturally of like the feeling of going to something and someone saying, sorry, you have to leave, like that kind of fear, can push people away. And especially as there's this moving target of bureaucracy, right? Like where
Exactly.
our April election, it was like up until literally the day before, it was unclear where you should go or how it would work. So yeah, absolutely. The just creating bureaucracy and have it churn is a way of turning young people away.
That's kind of the broader issue with the whole Act 23. It wasn't just putting up all these roadblocks. It was making them, it was so much and it's so confusing that, a lot of people just go, forget it. And think, great for you, Bree, that you actually went back. A lot of people would have walked away from that first bad experience and went, you know what? They don't want my vote. I'm humiliated. Forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. A lot of people. Yeah. So good for you for not giving up.
Can I ask one question as we transition into the next section? I mean, one of the premises, so just to put this in play, of all the bureaucracy, all the different steps, all the different sort of hoops people need to jump through, is built around the premise of keeping voting safe and mitigating voter fraud. And, if I worked in any kind of professional setting, you kind of deal with the problems that are in front of you, not the ones that you've made up to deal with. So my question is, does anybody, you guys are experts on this kind of thing, do you know of there being widespread voter fraud among students or any vulnerabilities in the system as they exist that are causing the city of 300,000 people to be vulnerable to folks that want to disrupt the integrity of our elections? One word answer is fine.
To be honest with you, the only voter fraud that I am aware of, because it made it into the news, was mostly Republicans. Let's just be true. Overvoting there was one famous case in Shorewood where a man literally stole the IDs from his adult children's wallets, made copies, and then voted absentee in their names so that he could have a few extra votes for Scott Walker. He was prosecuted. There were a couple other cases which are kind of sad, of people who lose spouses, elderly people who still submit their dead spouse's ballot.
Which college?
That person. And they also got caught. I don't know if they're prosecuted as strongly as the others. but
Which
that is
which
about it.
college did they attend?
Yeah, they didn't really attend
Oh.
any colleges, and actually, there was not a single case brought up during all of the cases that I've read. Not a single case of a college student fraudulently voting.
If you're a student out there watching and trying to learn how to facilitate, the way that I just asked questions was very bad. Don't ask leading questions in that way. But Peter, what are you going to say?
I want to add more than a one-word answer. I mean, because obviously the answer is no to your original question. But if I could, like, this is a conversation I think we're all talking about. We're all talking about the integrity of our elections and what makes the integrity of our elections. So I believe an election with integrity is one that is free, fair, and accessible. And we can list out things that aren't free, fair, or accessible about our elections as they are. So, like a couple questions: what's free about 68,000 individuals serving a felony sentence being not eligible to vote until they complete the terms of their sentence? What is fair about a certain group of people in the assembly having 64% of the power, but only having received 46% of the vote in the last election? What is accessible about needing to get a driver's license or a photo ID at a Division of Motor Vehicles center when there are only 80 across 72 counties, and only 7 of those centers have Saturday hours, and those Saturday hours are only open 3.5 hours. So I think, like, I get very worked up, as you can tell, when we talk about anything related to fraud, because that is not the issue. The issue, similarly, in the topic of our integrity of our elections, but we need to be focusing on the list of things that make our elections not free, not fair, and not accessible.
And as you all begin to think about some of the topics you want to share relative to your organizations, let me add a little more historical context, because we need to call the voter ID laws what they are, and they are just the reincarnation or the long extension of Jim Crow era policies that deny folks the right to vote. They are intended to disfranchise as many people as possible. Our particular policy was passed under the auspices that it would prevent immigrants from voting fraudulently and felons from voting fraudulently. And that is nothing more than the racialized fears that we saw during the Jim Crow era informing policy and informing ways in which to limit the democratic process to folks, particularly people of color. Then, of course, when we think about the job-related challenges that come into play when you have to go get the right ID, you got to take time off work. There are costs associated with that. So then it begins to operate like a poll tax, right? And so, of course, for those of you who don't have to go through that, you're essentially grandfathered in. So in some ways, they have remnants of a grandfather clause in other ways. And so you have racialized imagery, you have finances being a part of the disfranchising process, and it's Jim Crow in the 21st century in so many ways, and it's just, I think it's important for us to call it what it is.
Yeah.
Well, you all may not be able to, because you obviously have to be nonpartisan, but I'm gonna call it what it is.
You're saying, like, I was just thinking about, like, the generational trauma and, like, me being turned away from voting, like me not understanding it back then, but now it was like, wow, something really must have hit me to be like, because I went home, I was sad, I was mad about it, and not saying that I wasn't into politics as much, but I really didn't care about the election. I just wanted to go vote. It was my first time voting. But I felt like really hurt by that. And it was a pain like I didn't really understand at the time, because it wasn't something that I cared about, but it was something that people before me cared about. And that's why it hurt as much as it did. So like you were saying, it is just a reincarnation of, Jim Crow policies in today's time period. And the only reason behind it is to, like you said, keep specific groups from voting. Because there's literally no reason, as we heard, there's really no reason for it to exist, but it exists based off, like you said, racial lines, and, just partisan lines as well, because we understand, like, who's is helping and who's is not helping. But.
Yeah. Well, let's change the tone a little bit. What do we do? What's the battle? What's the struggle? What are we up to? Peter, you want to get us started? Talk to us about All Voting is Local, what you're up to, your issues and campaigns.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, All Voting is Local is a nonpartisan voting rights project, the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. A number of different campaigns. I think the first thing that I want to mention, because it's very specific to what we were just discussing, is education. So, generally speaking, we fight to eliminate needless and discriminatory barriers to the ballot before they happen to help build a better democracy. One of the ways we do that is educational pieces. So, I think it's really important for folks to know here that you can go to bringit.wi.gov and see the list of permissible or acceptable photo IDs for voting. And if you think you don't have an acceptable photo ID, like go to that website first, double check, and then make sure you have one. I think a lot of people are just, the photo ID law is designed to confuse, so we want to make sure that information gets into the hands of folks first to eliminate some of that confusion. But anyway, so then a number of different campaigns working to fight some of these discriminatory barriers. Felony disenfranchisement is one. No person should ever lose the right to vote. Thinking about our eligible voters in jail, many individuals in our Wisconsin County jails haven't lost the right to vote. If you're serving a sentence for misdemeanor, unless it's a misdemeanor for treason or bribery, you're still eligible to vote. Many folks in our jail are just don't have the money to post cash bail. So we need to make sure that there are clear policies and processes in place for individuals in Wisconsin County jails to be able to vote. Some of these student pieces, and working in coalition with so many other great groups to make sure that our election day polling places are properly staffed, that there are ballot return options, that it's as easy as possible to cast an absentee ballot. A lot of different things in the docket. But it's really wonderful to be able to work with so many great organizations like the Campus Vote Project, like CURTO, and others in the state around some of these issues.
Thanks, man. We appreciate all that you do. My own interest in legal history and civil rights law, it's as I mentioned to you, is excited to be in any way connected to your organization and the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights. So thank you so very much. Nate provided some important commentary in our chat. Seniors and disabled have unique barriers as well. And so before we wrap up, if either of you want to address that topic, please do. In the meantime, Kristen, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Campus Vote Project?
Sure. As I said, the Campus Vote Project is a program of the Fair Elections Center. The reason that's important is because all of the voting guides that we share and the resources we share are vetted by our attorneys. So if you go to our website, there's a map of the country. If you click on any state, because of course we have students at campuses in Wisconsin who are from other states and may choose to vote either at home because they're still at home because of COVID, or they want to vote absentee from their home address. Any of those states, you can click and there's a guide to what the student voting laws are in that state. So that's really handy to have. And we also are really on top of these things. So if something changes again with something to do with our voting laws, we're going to get that information out to you immediately. The Campus Vote Project works to institutionalize voting and democracy work within a campus. And we'll work with technical colleges, four-year colleges, community colleges, doesn't matter. The point of it is we want the work that we do to survive beyond any particular faculty, staff member, or student group. So it has to be something that the entire campus agrees to take on as an all the time project. We provide paid fellows to help with that work every semester. And we're not just there for voting years. So while obviously voting in the election in November is going to be a big part of what we do this year, we will be there next year taking on a different issue related to democracy. And maybe it's going to be keeping your elected officials accountable. We just had a bunch of elections. How do you keep that democracy going by reaching out to your elected officials and making sure they know that you are watching them, that you're going to hold them accountable to what they said they were going to do for you, and that you'll vote them out if they don't. We have too many cases in this country of people getting elected and then just staying in those same jobs over and over and over again, all the while ignoring the will of the people. So continuing that democracy work is a big part of what we do too. And I do want to say that again, Campus Vote Project, the All In Challenge, Andrew Goodman, All Voting is Local. There's a whole coalition of us. We all work together and we all have different little pieces of the pie. So there's a lot of organizations working with campuses in Wisconsin right now to make sure they have the resources and the information they need to help students vote. So if you know of any campus that really needs some help, email me. My information is in the chat. Google us. You can check in with some of the other organizations too, but we are here to help, and everything we provide to you is free.
And I appreciate that. Thank you so very much, Kristen. I had a chance to pop into some of the coalition meetings, and it is it's a really rich group of folks. Like this is the right people in conversation with one another. It really is impressive, and I'm just very thankful for what you do. Bree, talk to us a little bit about the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and I know we're in the early phases of that relationship with them, but as best as you can, tell us what's going on with that AGF effort.
Oh, Andrew Goodman, I'm pretty sure everyone on the panel knows who he is, but he was a freedom fighter who went down to Mississippi to go register voters with two other people. Let me make sure I get their names correctly. I don't want to.
All right, James Chaney and Mickey Schwerner.
And I can pronounce the last name, Mickey Schwerner. Yeah. They went down and they were murdered by the KKK. And I think it was their first day they went out to register, and that kind of sparked national, publicity, and it also ended up helping with the Civil Rights Act of getting passed, voting rights. So, what the Andrew Goodman Foundation Vote Everywhere program is like a national nonpartisan organization that is on campus, and it's still following Andrew Goodman's, dream to empower young voters and empower young people to help others feel empowered in their vote. So what we're doing right now is just campaigning and making sure to get the word out and educating others. We're still like in the start, as Dr. Smith said, of our program on campus, but we're really new. It's me and Jay, and Ben helps a lot with that. So shout out to Ben and Jay. But right now we're still working on getting things done, but registering voters is our main priority right now, and just helping out wherever we can when it comes to, voter advocacy.
Yeah, we're looking forward to being engaged with the Andrew Goodman Foundation. The great thing was, because of our role engaging with the Andrew Goodman Foundation, we ended up pivoting back to Peter and Kristen somehow. So somehow we were all dumped into some similar conversations. So this is great when our efforts begin to align in the way that they have. Let's start to think about some Q&A. Do you all have any other thoughts you want to add about the work you're doing, and then offer any of those comments, and then we'll start to head into some Q&A with our folks. And what we typically do with Q&A, because of the number of attendees is functional, we just promote them to panelists, and then we chat for a little bit in case they have some comments. But go ahead, Kristen, you have something to
Yeah,
share?
I have one thing that I wanted to bring up, and that is that we rarely speak of, and that is probably the most consequential thing for college students of voting rights was the 26th Amendment to the Constitution that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And I think this is especially powerful with all the protests and all the rallies that students are participating in right now. This happened in 1971 when young people were being sent off to the Vietnam War and didn't even have the right to vote. It's kind of shocking to remember that until 1971, that's not that long ago, you could be 18 years old, you could be married, you could be at war, you could own a home, you could own a business, you could, have all of these responsibilities and did not have the right to vote. And then, of course, the 19th Amendment giving the right to vote to women. Without those two amendments, we wouldn't be sitting here right now.
It's been a much longer history in this nation that the fewer and fewer folks have been able to vote compared to where we are today. This is in a lot of ways far newer terrain than we ever realized. So thank you for emphasizing that, Kristen. That's really important. All right, we're going to go to Q&A now. We're going to start promoting some of our folks who are with us to panelists. And so as you join us, feel free to join our conversation in any ways you might like. And go ahead, Adam.
I have a lot of questions, but one of them is just with kind of the organizational dynamic of organizing on campuses and with youth, which is inherently through time a transient population. Like, do you know, like not only do students spend 2 or 4 years or whatever it is at a campus and progress, it's constantly sort of refilling itself. And as a 35-year-old who doesn't feel young anymore, I know I have a different cultural place and where my voice is effective in reaching youth. So can you guys talk a little bit about that dynamic of how you keep that drumbeat going and not just having to restart at every election? How do you create some durable structures in campus spaces where it's not just saying, well, it's a brand new group of students, it's time to strike up the band again?
I'll start with that because Campus Vote, obviously that's what we do. And your point is exactly why we exist. Mm-hmm. Because too often, and I have some campuses I'm working with now that are stuck in this rut, that the student government organization is charged with working with students about registering to vote and then actually voting. But again, you could have some real great people one year and then those people, graduate, and it's just, that is just exactly why we exist, to avoid that. We work with the administrations. Usually it's a civic engagement director or a student life director, sometimes residence halls, that person becomes our point of contact, and they have to get approval from their higher ups. So this has, approval all the way up to the president of the college. And we are there bugging whoever is in that position. So even if Joe Schmo moves on from that role, I'm still there going, okay, Jane Doe, now you're the leader of civic engagement on this campus. I'm going to be giving you 2 democracy fellows. Let's figure out who they're going to be. We're going to pay them to do this work 10 to 15 hours a week, all semester long. So, it's not on you, it's on the fellows. We're giving them all the training. We're making sure they're on top of what's going on. We're making sure they know digital organizing. During COVID time, everything's going to be digital. So we are kind of that layer that makes sure it keeps going once a campus agrees to join us and become a voter-friendly campus. And that's because you're right. That's what exactly could happen is there's one staff member, and maybe it's someone whose job has nothing to do with voting, but they're just passionate about it personally, and they do it for maybe 10, 20 more years, and all of a sudden they retire and nobody picks up the ball. So we're there to hand the ball to someone else. Make sure somebody's always got the ball.
It is almost like a football program. Sorry to be a jock for a second. Yeah, where you can have a coaching staff and a system. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like that might not be relatable.
It's funny that you bring that up because one of my non-Wisconsin groups that I'm working with are the Syracuse University athletics department decided they were going to do their own voting rights program, even though the school isn't doing one. So and they did a fantastic job. So yeah,
nice.
There is, and they've brought athletics into a lot of what they're doing, so it can be done.
Bree, did you want to add anything about that? Because I think at the core of the question, I was, talking about what are the structures of it. But as you sort of pointed out, there's sort of a, how does it live within a campus culture, right? Like how can students be effective advocates to others, or who can be effective advocates to other students and compelling them to vote?
Really, I think it just comes down to people who are very vocal on campus already. And once they get to talking to people, then they become more empowered in it. So you just kind of ask questions about like, hey, how do you feel about voting? Are you interested in voting? How do you feel about politics, things like that. And once you kind of get their ear, then everyone just kind of falls into it as well. So it's not really like a one person thing. I think it's more of a group oriented thing as well. Just kind of helping other people find their voice while you're just kind of
Sure.
just asking questions, things like that. It's like back to sports, kind of like a point guard, just throwing the ball and passing the ball to them and, making sure they get their shots off and stuff like that. So that's really what it is. But in my experience, I really just feel like it depends on also just the climate of politics in general. So if it's good or if it's something that's going to make people want to go out and vote, or if it's something that's going to make people say, oh, we need to get some change going, it's going to be much easier to get people involved. Whereas if it's something kind of like a local election, unless it was, like a popular one we just had. But besides that, it's kind of like no, people don't really not into it as much. But if it is, then if the political climate allows for everyone to be like super involved, it's much easier to just get people to say like, hey, come vote,
Sure.
Nate's got a question. Nate, you're a panelist. You can unmute and pose that, but his question is about voter-friendly campus designations. Do we have names of those? Can we find those somewhere?
We can definitely find those someplace. There's so many of them. I'm not sure all of them are listed individually on our website. The requirements are that you, whoever Nate is, if somebody can get me his info, I'll send it. You just need to sign a statement of interest. Click through our website to the Voter Friendly Campus website, sign a statement of interest, ignore all the deadlines that are there. And then I will pop in now that you've showed your interest and help you create a plan. And then you work that plan and become a voter friendly campus. So the whole thing is done with our support along the way. And wherever you're from, we'd love to have you.
Cool.
Can I offer another thought? Just real. I still remember I was in college in 2004, and I remember sitting in the dining hall after the election returns were starting to turn in, or maybe the next day, and young people like my friends who hadn't really thought about voting a ton before, having voted for the first time and feeling really a crushing defeat, having voted for John Kerry, and feel like. And I think to me, if you place, and this isn't to at all undermine any of the work you guys are describing, but if you place so much weight in the terminal act of voting, as opposed to it being part of a larger civic diet that you have of involvement, it can become this kind of like binary, I won or I lost, and maybe like deflate someone if they don't win, or not, feel that sense of disillusionment. Like, well, what was the point if the president is saying don't boo vote, and then I voted and it didn't matter, or it didn't affect anything? And we have to end now, so that was more. That's probably a really big thing. Yeah.
And I would just say
biography of it too. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, don't boo, vote, and fight for voting rights. There's reach out to any one of us, and we'll plug you into a way to get in this fight that interests you. So there's lots that can be done, not only to cast your ballot, but to make sure that others can do so as well.
Well, and I would also add, stay committed to democracy and not necessarily committed to politicians or political figures.
Good point.
That's another, and Kristen, you highlighted some of this earlier, but we can't emphasize enough the way that voting is very much almost popularity or familiarity or any number of those terms. And we just can't invest too much in political figures. We have to be far more committed to a process that gets us the outcomes that we want as a society. August 13th, we got a table talk. What we do each month is we gather the educators who've been listening in with us and joining us, and we spend a little bit of time talking about the themes and the topics and how to move that into the classroom. So if anybody wants to join us on August 13th, is that tomorrow? That might be tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Please send an email to us somewhere or another. Keisha, you probably should be doing this instead of me. But we'll be in touch about how, there we go. If anyone wants to join us, email Keisha Price and she'll make sure to get you the link. It's just an informal opportunity to talk about strategies for the classroom because, you know, we can find the importance of civics in all of our classes. So, Peter, Bree, Kristen, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
This was very, very informative. Our young people are so critical, as we know, not only in this moment of movement, but more broadly.